Hi, good evening. For us, this is a moment of great satisfaction and pride with the completion of JPPI's flagship project and its publication by Academic Studies Press and Yediot Sfarim. One can ask why we invested so much in this deep thinking project, so many years and so much brain power, at a time when we face so many immediate threats and where there is such pressing need for action-oriented planning. My answer is that even at a policy planning think tank like ours, processes such as this are essential if we are to see the picture in its entirety so that we can identify the right horizons and directions. 10 years ago, when we took our first steps, the Jewish people and Israel were in an unprecedented golden age. A flourishing Israel with the strongest army in the Middle East, with a thriving economy, the startup nation, and growing international acceptance. The Jewish diaspora, especially in the United States, was at the peak of its prosperity and of its intellectual and political influence. We were taught by history that all golden ages may one day come to an end. So we asked ourselves if it is possible to do anything about it. How can we cultivate elites, better structured governance, and the ability to implement essential long-term policies when half the Jewish people live in a state-organized political system, and the other half live their Jewishness in a fluid, voluntary community environment? How can we prepare for chance events? How can we delay the decline, or better yet, avoid it? Before I introduce our speakers, I would like to welcome you all, and especially Shalom Wald. For the last 8 years, he has headed a thoughtful experiment at JPPI to examine the work of historians from the last 2 millennia, to describe the rise and decline of nations and civilizations, and try to draw lessons for the Jewish people. His personal conclusion was to make Aliyah, and I want to congratulate it for doing so. I would like also to extend a special welcome to Professor Yehezkel Dror, a teacher to most of us when we were young students at the Hebrew University here on this campus, and my personal mentor here at the Institute during a time when my youth was already far behind me. Without his guidance and creativity, this work would never have begun and certainly could not have been completed. I would also like to thank President Shimon Peres for participating in some of the brainstorming sessions as the project developed and for writing the foreword to this book. I can't mention everybody who contributed to this effort, but aside from the staff, and foremost the editors Rami Tal and Barry Geltman, who challenged Shalom and helped bring the project to fruition, I would like to mention that we have here Ambassador Salai Meridor, who also followed this project, and Professor Chaim Waxman, a former senior fellow at the Institute. Acharon Chaviv, last but certainly not least, is Ambassador Dennis Ross, who accompanied this process from its inception at Y Plantation in 2006 with his insight and powerful sense, which helped us to understand better the challenges and opportunities facing us as members of the Jewish civilization, and to translate the findings to lessons for our people and our leadership. Now, almost a decade after we started the process, the Jewish civilization is at a new crossroads. One of the main questions is whether power is shifting from west to east, and the discourse emerging about a possible US decline already reflects a change in basic perceptions. If this is true, the implications for Israel and the Jewish people worldwide are immense. Since we are honored this evening to have with us JPPI's co-chairman, Ambassador Dennis Ross, one of the most highly regarded strategists in the United States today, I asked him to dedicate his opening remarks to this topic. Dennis, please.
Well, tonight isn't about me or my opening remarks, but it's about Shalom Wald. And I do recall when we met 8 years ago in White Plantation, and you circulated what was an outline and a set of themes that then became the basis for the book. He asked me if I read the book. Actually, he didn't ask. He asked me if I had looked at the book, and I said, yes, I have looked at the book. I've actually gone through the book, but I haven't really read it yet. But I have to say, just even in a quick glance through the book, it's a powerful study, and it's a remarkable reminder of the value of doing the kind of historical research, or in your case, a thought experiment, where one goes back and tries to identify what were the factors that either led to success or failure, and how can you apply these in different circumstances. Applying it to the question of the Jewish future was, I think, extraordinarily innovative, and as Avinoam said, fits in a sense profoundly what is the work of the JPPI. Now, what I've been asked to comment on briefly is this notion of the image of America's decline. And I thought about a way to talk about that, since it seems to be taken as a conventional wisdom. And most conventional wisdoms reflect assumptions that get repeated over time, rarely questioned, are repeated enough that they become mythologies, and sooner or later you actually believe them. So I thought maybe one way to sort of deal with this, as opposed to giving a kind of rote argumentation one way or the other, is to give you an example of something. And it's an example of what was a message that came from the Saudi kings to the White House, in which it encapsulated, stated the following: the region is going the way of your enemies. Every one of your friends is feeling vulnerable. The United States appears to be sitting on the sidelines and doing nothing about it. And your friends increasingly can no longer count on you. Now, what I've just said, most of you will assume probably just happened, right? Do you assume that this is a message that was recently conveyed from the Saudi king to the White House? It's a rhetorical question. You're supposed to answer yes. We assume that. Well, that is a message from October 1969. And it was after the coup in Libya. And it was conveyed to Henry Kissinger. And it was repeated by almost every one of, not just the Saudis, but almost every one of America's friends in the region at that time. Now, the last time I checked, the region and those friends somehow didn't disappear, and the region wasn't seen as a loss to the United States. I cite this as an example that you can take a snapshot at different moments, and you can draw certain kinds of conclusions. But before you draw larger conclusions about the direction and weight of American power, one really needs to look at this, I think, not only with some perspective, but also look at it over time. It is not the first time that we've seen periods where America's resolve and credibility have been questioned. I suspect it's not going to be the last time that's been the case. Many of America's friends in this region feel highly vulnerable. Because they feel highly vulnerable for a different set of reasons, they will project their sense of weakness onto the United States and what the United States is either doing or not doing. You know, at a time when the United States actually has 40,000 forces in the Persian Gulf, we're seen as being unreliable. I can go through all the reasons why questions have been raised about us right now. Obviously, we didn't act on the Syrian Red Line militarily. There's the image of the U.S. as being completely geared towards withdrawing from the region, not engaging in the region. There's the perspective of the effect of energy independence on the United States. I can go on and recite the reasons why these perceptions exist. What I would say is, when they've existed in the past, and what I could add to you, I cited one message from October 1969. The fact is, I happen to be doing a book on the U.S.-Israeli relationship from Truman through Obama, which inevitably becomes really the story of the U.S. approach to the Middle East, because the U.S.-Israeli relationship, president's attitudes, perspectives, the national security environment, the national security establishment's assumptions are very heavily shaped by how they perceive the region, and Israel is derivative of that. I can literally give you an example from almost every decade, at least from the 1950s on, where there were similar periods where the U.S. was perceived the way it's perceived right now. In almost every case, when the U.S. engaged in an action that produced an impression of success, suddenly this fear of the American decline was reversed. Now, it's true, you could say to me, look, at some point the decline could become real. At some point, America's weariness and wariness about being entangled in conflicts in the Middle East that are inherently messy and hard to resolve may become a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. And it is true that today there is a weariness and there is a wariness. 2 wars that cost the United States probably $3 trillion, at least 8,000 dead, 70,000 wounded, in situations that don't materially look better as a result of our involvement, have created that impression. But it would also be misleading in one important respect. There have been other times when we have engaged in processes of retrenchment and then our behavior changed. There is a self-image in the United States. And the self-image is that we will play a certain role in the world. And when we are perceived as becoming, in the eyes of the American body politic, not strong enough or not respected enough, the pendulum tends to swing again. So before you draw the conclusion that there's an inexorability to America's decline, and therefore Israel or other countries in the region are somehow going to be left on their own, I would ask you to take a step back, pause and reflect about how the United States has from time to time gone through these periods of retrenchment and then acted again, and realize that it's distinctly possible that in certain circumstances where the United States chooses to act, and if, for example, we were to be seen as being successful in terms of changing Iran's behavior on the nuclear issue and also countering and changing the balance of power in the region, then suddenly all of these concerns and fears about the inexorability of America's decline and the conclusions you will have to draw about Israel's behavior and its choices will look rather different.
The number of promising projects started is larger by order of magnitudes than the number of projects brought to a good conclusion. All the more so, it is really a pleasure to be here after this project of the Institute was brought to a good conclusion, with the main burden of concluding it, the more difficult part, being well undertaken by my friend, the present president of the Institute, Avinoam. Now, what is this project about? If I have to categorize a book, always dangerous for a broad study, I would call it a policy-oriented, history-based study of rise and decline applied to the Jewish people. There's 2 parts, a general, unique survey. I haven't seen in the literature anything similar of many thinkers on rise and decline, and the unique application to the Jewish people. What is the importance of it? Keynes, let me quote a statement by Keynes. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct, he says, economist, as a pop theories. Nothing can be done if we don't have in our mind, or explicitly subject to examination, a model of what makes things exist and change. Usually a pop model of simple causal chains. Ergo, it follows that one really cannot think on long-range policies. I don't say plan, this is too ambitious. but one cannot think on long-range issues and policies without having in the mind a model of relevant historic processes. And if we worry, we being the Jewish people, we being humanity, if we worry about the mix between thriving and decline, which is going to come increasingly shaped by human action because of the instruments to impact on the future supplied by science and technology, just think on human enhancement and its inconceivable results. We need models of rise and decline. However, open-ended, tentative learning, guesstimated, multiple, but without having some models explicated so they can be subjected to criticism and improvement, our long-range thinking is blah blah for policy purposes. I don't speak about imaginative science fiction, utopias, dystopias, who fill an important function, but this is another matter. This leads to a query. If the need is so obvious, why don't we have more of it? Why is this the first book, as far as I know, on rise and decline in a comprehensive collection of main views applied to the Jewish people? I have a number of answers to this question. One answer is, it isn't clear at all what is thriving and decline. For an ultra-Orthodox, a Jewish people, much smaller numbers, but all being ultra-Orthodox, will be thriving. It depends on values, what we call rise and decline. Second, there is this interesting historic tendency of metamorphosis. Let's say, if I take the history of the Dutch Empire and today's the Netherlands, the Dutch Empire, very successful against France, against Spain, economically, culturally. It's not an empire anymore, but Holland is a very nice country to live in. I could say the same on the British Empire, forget about it. And the UK today, theater in London, excellent. Even food is improved thanks to import. In other words, there is a difference between rise and decline. Easy to say on the Maya kingdom that it declined because it is rubbed out of history, and saying what is rise and decline for Israel or the Jewish people. We have to have a set of values, criteria, and on this there will be many disagreements. Second, let's admit it. We, humanity, scholars, policymakers, don't really understand deep historic processes. If we go through the literature, why Europe became the dominant civilization bloc of countries, why the scientific revolution happened in Europe and not in China, let's say, we will get 10, 15 explanations, each interesting, each looking plausible till you read the other explanations. Probably all the explanations have something to do, but they don't really add up to real understanding. The subject continues to be in debate. All the more so, if we want to ask ourselves what will shape the future of Western civilization in the changing world, we really don't understand processes well enough. Doesn't mean we can do anything. We can have tentative ideas on rise and decline, which permit concrete, practical policy recommendations, as in this book. This is another reason most politicians, as far as I know, personally or from reading or working around the world, don't really want it. They are clinging, necessarily so. It's not personal corruption, it's institutional failure to short electoral cycles, to roadblocks of relations between houses and congresses and so forth, between awakening street power, a new kind of mass action, helped them internet and the governments look on what's happening in Europe today. Politicians don't have time for these long-term considerations. That's a weakness, because we have no reason to think, let me put it differently, the idea, very optimistic, that progress in terms of present values is the right side of history forever is nonsense. Slavery was obviously accepted 250 years ago. Equality of women started more or less 50 years ago, more intensively. To say that present values will dominate humanity another 150 years, it's an extreme case of arrogance. Therefore, politicians really don't care about it enough. Still, thanks to the work of Shalom, we have a book before us which is useful also not only for understanding, which is important, not only for stretching the mind, very necessary, but also for policy purposes. Therefore, it is an integral part of the mission of the Jewish People Policy Institute. Let me conclude by illustrating. I will pick up 4 ideas at the end of the book by Shalom and transform them into tentative, more praxis-concrete recommendations. 1, commitment to living history. Yes, no, for sure. But what is this? It is easy after this term to have frozen traditionalism, which assures long-term decline in a changing world. What is living history? In Jewish terms, what values are a hard core without which there is no Jewish people, in terms of a civilization or a religion, as you wish? We cannot really do much if we don't have tentative ideas on that. Let's say, I think, whatever may be one's views, in order to strengthen cohesion and belonging to the Jewish people, in order to draw into the Jewish people the descendants of outmarriages. The Jewish people has to be, belonging to the Jewish people has to be a cause of pride. Not of overbearing, but of pride. By children and by granddaughters and grandboys have to be proud of belonging to the Jewish people. This cannot be done on the basis of the historic contributions. Living history means to do things of which one can be proud as belonging to the Jewish people. Let's say, playing a significant role in mending the world. Not by setting up another Peace Corps medical group, that's nice, I would say, but by cultural contributions that are striking, which humanity needs very much. And to be more concrete, the idea has been discussed at the Institute till one gets tired of it, but not been implemented, to set up a global, interactive Jewish People Studies University in multiple languages, partly based on internet, partly on special types of interactive tutoring with the modern technology and personal touch, so that it is easy for every Jew to gain some better insights if the program is interesting, multi-value, pluralistic, and helps to give a person a good feeling about belonging to the Jewish people without having a bad feeling when looking on others. Second recommendation of the book at the end, high-quality leadership and long-term policies. Well, I couldn't agree more. I myself write on it, not books. Setting up a Jewish people leadership academy has been talked about several times. Nothing. When I did surveys with the Institute, what's that happening in this field? Organizational leadership training, yes. Global leadership training, nothing, nothing, nothing. I get envious when I read about the recent decision with the World Economic Forum at the recent Davos meeting to set up an academia, a set of courses with the participation of top-level universities on distant and meetings, training of global leadership in different domains. Why don't we do something like this? Very good investment. Last but not least, on Jewish people policy making. I don't want to take time out on this, but I think one of the more interesting concepts in recent literature on it, most of the literature is pop, but there are some good books. Taleb has some very good books. His most famous, Black Swan, I leave aside, but his book on anti-fragility is very good. Anti-fragility, the idea is old, but he sharpens it, means to build up the capacity to use bad developments for thriving, or to use surprises for thriving. That's the old Chinese idea. A main leitmotif of a Jewish people state, a Jewish people craft, must be to look to use trouble as much as possible as an opportunity for moving ahead. Nearly last, Shalom recommends that Jews should be at the top of the knowledge revolution. Certainly I agree, but this is not enough. I think Jews have to be also, maybe even more so, at the top of civilizational global creativity. This is what the Jews were good at. Science and technology came later, after the Enlightenment, and I don't know how it will continue. Have to compete with some other very good civilizations. Asian civilizations, very good. But cultural creativity, this is something. Concerning geopolitical vision, well, how shall I put it? I started with a quote by Keynes. Let me finish with a quote from Lincoln in a famous speech quite some time before he became president. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I don't think I have to add interpretations. My own feeling, I may be biased, having been very much interested in this project. But this is a pioneering, critically important, unique book. It is obligatory reading, in my view, pondering upon, criticizing for all who are concerned about the future of the Jewish people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Dror. I'd like to invite now the real... Please.
Shalom, good evening. Very difficult to do better than Yehezkel Dror, whose pupil I was and I am, with the proviso of a saying of Friedrich Nietzsche.
Into the microphone.
With the
Books have to be read, speeches have to be heard.
I said, I am and I remain your pupil, but with one proviso, quoting Friedrich Nietzsche, you do your teacher a bad service if you remain only a student. Man tut seinem Lehrer einen schlechten Dienst, wenn man immer nur sein Schüler bleibt. Apart from this, I'm very grateful to you for what you did to promote this project. I'm grateful to the Institute. They paid me 5 or 6 years of salary to write the thick book. And they paid you a 2-hour dinner. You know the saying, there is no free lunch, maybe, but there is a free dinner, at least a free dinner. Now, if you compare 5 years of my work to 2 hours, it looks to me like the 3,200 years of Jewish history about which I write, against the 70 years, the next few years of Israel, of the Jewish people. So I'm not surprised that during those 2 hours, the 2 speeches so far are about those 70 years and the next few years. Well, I do not want to speak about Israel a lot this evening, but I would like to submit a few ideas to you, which are not always written clearly in my book, but which come out of my book, about how the story of young Israel relates to the very long history of the Jewish people. I'd like to use a metaphor. Israel is a double-headed eagle, a double-headed bird. Like the ancient emblem of the Russian Empire, which included Poland, or of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. Now, when I look around here, many of the grand and grandparents of us, of you, come from these 2 empires. So the emblem of the 2-headed eagle shouldn't be too disturbing for you. One head of the eagle looks to the present and the future, the other head looks to the past. Let's speak of the present and the future. Israel is a revolution. It's a break of history. In significance and depth, it is as deep as the French or the Russian Revolution, also, of course, not in outreach to the rest of the world. And we have to know that there has never been a revolution without bloodshed, without turmoil, without terrible injustices committed to innocent people. Also, every revolution is a mental and moral offense. It subverts every transmitted order of things, and it offends major established beliefs. This is the reason why every revolution, including our revolution, the creation of Israel, triggers enormous hostility, lasting efforts to undo the achievements of the revolution and return to the state before. It's a reaction in the true sense. The term reactionary was coined in France as a sign of the hostility to the French Revolution. Some of the hostility to Israel today is truly reactionary in the old sense, in the old French sense. And some of this hostility will not go away quickly, even as we hope there will one day be peace between us and the Palestinian people. Now, let's talk of the second head of the eagle. And let's look at history, which is my main concern, which was my main interest in the book. I would like to paraphrase Clausewitz, the Prussian strategist. You know that he wrote, "War is the continuation of politics by other means," and I would like to say Israel is the continuation of Jewish history by other means. So Israel is both a revolution and a continuation. There is a Chinese saying, Yehezkel Dror spoke of China. We both think highly of Chinese history and the Chinese future. The Chinese like to say you must explain current events by looking at history. That's what the Chinese do, actually. So one of my aims was to discover in the Jewish people and Israel today the contours of old history, the shadows of the past. What's the purpose of all this? Can we learn from history? Does history inform decision makers? Does history improve decisions? My book says yes, it can. To be honest with you, there are days where I have doubts. In fact, all decisions by all policymakers are always taken with some open or hidden reference to recent or past events. But in fact, history never repeats itself exactly. There are so many different ways to interpret history. There is so much deliberate falsification of history and so much unwilling misunderstanding of history It's extraordinary that today, in these days, the discussion on why the World War I broke out and who was responsible is flaring up again. This discussion has lasted now 100 years. It started basically in 1918. In the meantime, during the last 100 years, virtually every country's archives have been opened. There is virtually nothing secret about the deliberations of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, of the Russian Empire, of France, of England, of every other country. 1,000 books have been written, and we still are not sure. What is it that led to this terrible war? Who is ultimately responsible? Where? Was it the Germans? Was it not the Germans? It's extremely difficult to draw from history conclusions for the present. So, then why look at history at all? Why look at history? I believe history helps us to see current events in a more detached, a more philosophical, maybe even more objective way, in a less emotional, less exaggerated way. Maybe this can help us to avoid mistakes. Maybe this can give our decision makers food for thought. Food for thought is a term we used in the OECD. My main career was in the OECD. When we realized that the OECD had lost its executive power. We could not make decisions anymore. We still wrote many papers to governments. We called it food for thought. At least let them think, even if we can't decide about currency exchanges, etc. So, food for thought. Many believe that much that is happening today is new. It's unprecedented, unheard of. In fact, very little is completely unprecedented. Very little is completely unprecedented. Let me give you 3 examples from Jewish history, to which I relate partly in my book. From the early 19th century to today, from the Haskalah to the emancipation, from the emancipation to the anti-Semitism, to the Shoah, to the rebirth of Israel, we have lived in a deep transformation of Judaism and Jewish history. Many feel that there has never been such a period in Jewish history. Well, this is not so. This is the 3rd period of deep transformation of history. There was one following the destruction of the first temple in 586 BC. There is a 2nd one, a very deep one, following the destruction of the 2nd temple in 70 CE. Let me give you one detail about the year 70. We have this from Flavius Josephus. Then the Kohanim, many of the Kohanim saw the temple going up in flames. They could not imagine that Judaism would survive in any form without the temple, and they did not wish to live in a world without Judaism. They threw themselves in the dozens into the flames to die with the temple. These people who killed themselves would come back here, listen to us. They wouldn't believe that we are Jews. They wouldn't understand what happened. So let's not forget this. Transformations of that depth that we are in last 300, 400, 500 years. It's very, very difficult to shorten them, to compress them. Our transformation, the transformation of the Jewish people, of Judaism, is maybe 200 years old. It started 200 years ago. It could last another 100, it could last another 200 years. Nobody can tell what Judaism will be in 200 years, but I am hopeful there will be Judaism. How it will look, we don't know. Let me give you a second example. That's more actual now. Israel today has to cope with a non-Jewish minority of 20-25%. Our policies towards this minority are in flux and have often been criticized. The new, very important JPPI project on how Israel can be Jewish and democratic will address this very important issue. It's good to know that this is not a new issue at all. It is in fact one of our oldest challenges. During the entire Second Temple period of more than 500, maybe 600 years, there was never a time, never a period without a strong non-Jewish minority living in this land. We have no figures, 10%, 20%, 30% non-Jews, Greeks, Romans,
Armenians, God knows what. I tend to believe in a high figure, but I don't want to go into 30%, maybe even more. I don't want to go into this. We can speculate about this. There's a lot of indications in ancient sources. Jews cope with our minorities in different ways. Can we learn from this? I don't know. We know from the past what we cannot do, what we must not do. I give you the example of one thing we cannot do. It is forced Judaization. The Hasmonean rulers of the 2nd and 1st century had the policy of forcing non-Jews to become Jews. It's the only case in Jewish history I know of where non-Jews were forced to become Jews. This is a radical and actually mostly successful policy. It is unacceptable to Judaism, though it was widely practiced by later Christianity and Islam. So we know what we cannot do. What can we do? I leave this to the people who will deal with democracy and Judaism. Let me give you a third story. It's a sort of juicy case story, a very specific story. In the last years, a number of criminal investigations involving Orthodox rabbis have come to light in Israel, including one chief rabbi. Now, this is shocking and apparently unprecedented, some would say. Not at all, not unprecedented. In the second half of the 18th century, Vilna was perhaps the most creative center of Jewish intellectual and religious life in Europe, certainly in Eastern Europe, a center of learning like no others at that time. It had one of the largest Jewish populations in Europe. About 6,000 Jews lived in Vilna in 1750, as against less than 2,000 or 1,000 to 2,000 in Berlin. The Gaon of Vilna, famous Gaon of Vilna, lived there, who secluded himself from life in the city completely. During this period, there was a string of corruption scandals involving the rabbinic leadership. Now, in 1785, the chief rabbi of Vilna, Rav Shmuel ben Avigdor, was found to be engaging in several criminal activities, apart from drawing in exorbitant salaries from the community. He had to be deposed. It was intolerable to have him there. The Jews alone were unable to throw him out. They needed the help of the non-Jewish city authorities of Vilna to throw him out. So nothing is unprecedented in our history, unfortunately, and maybe fortunately also. A last comment. To whom is this book addressed? Who should read it? I wish I knew who was reading the Hebrew translation of my book. The Hebrew translation came out in August with very little publicity. In a few months, it was completely sold out. I still get phone calls from Israeli friends who tell me we would like to buy your book. We go to Shaimatsky, they tell us it's completely sold out. We can't find the book. I hope they will reprint it. So who is reading this book? I would be very interested, because it's not an easy book to read, but I think it's very encouraging that there is apparently in Israel a reading public that is ready to read the very complicated book, excellently translated into Hebrew by our friend Emmanuel Lotem, sitting there. Who are the people who read this book? Why do they buy it? I got all sorts of letters from people I never heard of, congratulating me. One came from Herzliya here to Yerushalayim to interview me about the book. So if I knew who is reading this book, maybe I could say something about who I want to read this book in English. Well, I would like to speak of four audiences. I would hope that the English will be read by a Jewish reading public that is concerned with the danger of decline, that is concerned with the future of the Jewish people. I would very much like that a large non-Jewish public would read it, because the non-Jewish public has for a long time not seen a review of all Jewish history that is not polemical, that tries to be objective. Number three, maybe a few Jewish policymakers or advisors may want to read it and reflect, food for thought, as I mentioned. And last but not least, I would very much like some Jewish history scholars to read it. Only one is here, Professor Yitzhak Shikor, he read it. In general, I'm quite pessimistic. I don't think there's great chance that it will be read, but I may be too pessimistic. all Jewish historiography today is microhistory. It's about history of specific events, periods, places, countries, or persons. Most academic scholars who see the title of this book will hold their nose and walk away. You don't write about open Jewish history. The last comprehensive scholarly history book of history of the Jewish people dates back to 1967. It's the book of H.H. Ben Sasson. This is 50 years. A lot of research has been carried out in the last 50 years. A lot of new facts have come to light. And there is no comprehensive book that brings this to the conscience of the public. The gap of the lack of such a book is increasingly worrying. And if our scholars do not fill it, the charlatans and the anti-Zionists will fill it. It has already begun. See the enormous success of the books of Shlomo Zand in various countries. Thank you for coming here, and thank you for helping me with this book.